The uneventful beginning. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, one of those days that blended into the routine. The alarm had barely stirred me from a light sleep, and the chill of the September air made me reluctant to get out of bed. My small room seemed even quieter than usual, like the house itself was holding its breath. My parents had already left for work and I was the only one home. The thought of skipping crossed my mind. Maybe today wasn't worth the trouble, but a faint pull urged me to go. School felt as monotonous as ever. The hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional squeak of sneakers against the polished floor, teachers droning on with half-hearted enthusiasm. It was just another day in my senior year. Yet there was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. A strange stillness, as though the very walls were watching. By lunch I was already counting the minutes until I could leave. I headed toward my locker, its chipped paint flaking off like the forgotten memories of students who had come before. But as I turned the combination lock, I noticed something strange. The usually loud chatter of the hallway had dulled to an eerie silence. My hands froze on the lock as a shiver crept down my spine. The air was thick, too thick for a school day. I glanced around, expecting to see the usual chaos of high school life, groups of students, a teacher rushing by, but instead the corridor was empty. I blinked, confused. It had been bustling a second ago. The hum of the fluorescent lights grew louder, almost deafening now, and a subtle vibration pulsed through the floor beneath my feet. It felt as if the building itself was alive, breathing in sync with my growing unease. As I turned back to my locker, I heard it, a soft thud coming from somewhere behind the walls. At first, it was distant, like something heavy was moving below, far below. Another thud, louder this time, and then silence. I quickly opened my locker, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at me. I grabbed my books, forcing myself to act normal. But the sound persisted, faint but rhythmic, echoing just beyond the walls. My curiosity got the better of me, as it always does. I closed the locker and slowly walked toward the source. It seemed to be coming from the basement, a place no one ever talked about. It was an old part of the school and used for decades, or so I'd heard. I hesitated, looking around once more. The hallway was still eerily vacant, as if time had paused just for me. And then, without any warning, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then darkness. My heart raced as the flickering lights finally gave way to complete darkness. I stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, the silence now suffocating, pressing down on me from every angle. The thud I had heard earlier, it was louder now, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a heartbeat pulsing beneath the surface of the school. I couldn't stay here. Something was pulling me forward, a strange compulsion that made my legs move even as my brain screamed at me to turn back. But I didn't. I couldn't. I found myself walking deeper into the school toward the old wing, a part of the building long abandoned and sealed off. I had heard rumors about it, legends passed down by students over the years, whispered in hushed tones during lunch or before assemblies. Most of the stories revolved around an old cellar hidden beneath the school. Some said it was just a storage space that had been forgotten, others claimed it was much more sinister. A place where strange rituals were held decades ago, a place that had a dark history buried beneath layers of brick and time. The cellar, they said, had been locked for good reason. As I approached the end of the hallway, I noticed a door that I had never seen before. It was slightly ajar, its wooden surface chipped and worn with age. A strange draft seeped through the crack, cool and almost damp, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent that made my skin crawl. I swallowed hard, feeling the familiar twinge of fear in the back of my throat, but I couldn't shake the pull that guided me forward. The door led to a staircase, narrow and steep, descending into the unknown. The air grew colder as I stood at the top of the steps, staring down into the darkness below. The walls were lined with old stone, slick with moisture, and the shadows seemed to twist and shift, as if they had a life of their own. My breath fogged in front of me and I shivered, the temperature dropping unnaturally fast the further I descended. I shouldn't be here. Every instinct told me to turn back, but my feet moved on their own, step by cautious step, deeper into the belly of the school. The stairwell seemed to go on forever, spiraling down in a way that defied the school's structure. The sound of my breathing echoed against the damp walls, and each step I took sent a faint creak through the oppressive silence. And then there was that noise again, the thud. Closer now, like it was waiting for me at the bottom. The legends flashed through my mind, stories of students who had dared to explore this place, only to return shaken, pale, their mouths sealed tight as if the darkness itself had stolen their voices. Some didn't return at all. I thought they were just stories meant to scare the underclassmen, but now I wasn't so sure. At last I reached the bottom of the stairs. Before me an old iron door loomed, rusted and thick, with no obvious handle or lock. My fingers brushed against its cold surface, and an unnatural chill surged through me, numbing my hand. It was like touching something long dead. The thud came again, louder, this time right behind the door. I took a deep breath and pushed. The door groaned as it swung inward, revealing a vast, shadowy room. My phone's flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, casting thin beams of light across the stone floor. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols etched deep into the rock, some faded with time, others freshly carved. I couldn't make sense of them, but their jagged lines and spirals made me uneasy. The air smelled musty and stale, but underneath it all was that same metallic tang I'd caught earlier. Blood. No, it couldn't be. I stepped inside. The room felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. My footsteps echoed louder than they should have, and the walls seemed to close in around me, the air pressing against my skin. In the far corner, I saw something, a shape hunched low to the ground, partially hidden in shadow. My heart hammered in my chest as I took slow, deliberate steps toward it, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming to leave, but the pull was stronger now. I had to see. I had to know. The shape became clearer. It was a door. Smaller than the one I had just entered, but ancient, with thick iron bands crisscrossing its wooden surface. It looked out of place, older than the school itself, as though it had been buried here long before the foundation was even laid. Without thinking, I reached for the handle, my fingers brushing against the cold iron. The moment I touched it, a sharp, stinging pain shot through my hand and I pulled back, gasping. The air felt charged, electric, as if something had been disturbed. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening crash, plunging the room into total darkness. My heart raced as I spun around, my phone's flashlight flickering in and out. The temperature plummeted and I could feel something watching me. I tried to calm myself, but then, from behind the smaller door, I heard it, the faintest whisper, barely audible, like a voice carried on the wind. It was low, guttural, and I couldn't make out the words, but it was speaking directly to me. The sound sent ice down my spine. Then the thud again. This time it wasn't behind the walls. It was closer. It was inside the room with me. I backed away from the smaller door, my heart pounding in my ears. As I did, the markings on the wall seemed to shimmer in the dim light, twisting and rearranging themselves, forming new shapes, familiar shapes. Faces. They were faces. Dozens of them, their hollow eyes staring back at me, mouths open in silent screams. I stumbled backward, tripping over something soft and damp on the floor. My phone flew out of my hand and skittered across the stone, its beam dancing wildly before it landed face up, casting long shadows across the room. My hands met something cold and wet, and when I looked down, I saw it. Blood. A pool of it, dark and viscous, seeping from the cracks in the floor. And then, in the distance from the small door, came a sound that made my blood run cold, the slow creak of it opening. I could barely breathe as the creak of the small door echoed in the cavernous room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a cold draft whispered through the opening, and with it came the faintest sound, something wet, something heavy, dragging itself across the floor. I couldn't move, rooted in place by the terror that gripped my chest like a vice. In the dim light of my fallen phone, the door slowly swung open, revealing a narrow passage beyond. My heart hammered against my ribs as I squinted into the shadows. Was I hearing things? Was my mind playing tricks on me? No, there it was again. That thud, now accompanied by a sickening squelch, like meat being torn from the bone. Against every ounce of self-preservation screaming in my head, I moved toward the opening. The air seemed to thicken with each step, a cloying stench rising from the passage. My hands shook as I bent down to retrieve my phone, its beam flickering weakly, casting erratic shadows that danced across the stone walls. Steeling myself, I stepped into the dark hallway, the door groaning shut behind me with a finality that sent chills up my spine. The space was narrow, suffocating, the walls slick with moisture, and the further I walked, the more the air seemed to hum with an unseen energy. My shoes squelched against the damp floor, the sound almost drowned out by the distant cries. I froze. Voices. Muffled but unmistakable. They weren't cries of pain, but something worse. The sound of whimpering, of fear being wrung from throats too hoarse to scream anymore. I moved forward, each step slow and deliberate, my pulse pounding in my ears. The passage widened suddenly, opening into a half-lit room. Dim, flickering bulbs hung from wires, casting an eerie glow over the scene before me. I wish I could unsee it. There they were, students. The same kids I had seen earlier in the halls, kids I had passed in class without a second thought. But now they were bound, tied to thick wooden beams that jutted from the stone floor like grotesque crosses. Their faces were streaked with grime and blood, their clothes torn and stained with sweat. Their eyes. God, their eyes were wide with terror, darting from side to side, as though they couldn't bear to look at what was standing in the center of the room. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was there, hunched over one of the students, a creature unlike anything I had ever imagined. Its skin was mottled, a sickly gray-green, stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Long, spindly arms dangled from its shoulders, the fingers unnaturally long and tipped with sharp yellowed claws. Its back arched grotesquely, the spine jutting out like broken glass beneath paper-thin skin. And its face, or what passed for a face, was a nightmare. A gaping maw rimmed with jagged teeth sat where a mouth should be, and its eyes were nothing but deep, hollow sockets that seemed to drink in the light, leaving nothing behind but darkness. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The monster leaned over one of the students, a boy who couldn't have been more than 15, its claws tracing slow, deliberate lines down his cheek. The boy's body convulsed with sobs, his eyes squeezed shut as if he could will himself away from the horror. And then the creature leaned closer, its mouth opening wider, revealing rows of sharp needle-like teeth glistening with some foul fluid. A scream rose in my throat, but I bit it back, my body trembling as I tried to shrink into the shadows. I couldn't help them. I couldn't save them. But then, in a single horrifying moment, the creature stopped. It froze, its head turning slowly, unnaturally in my direction. My blood ran cold as those empty sockets locked onto me, and despite the impossibility of it, I felt its gaze, heavy, piercing, suffocating. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in on me as that hollow gaze bore into my soul. And then it moved. It let out a sound, a deep, guttural hiss, a noise that scraped against my ears like nails on a chalkboard. The creature straightened, towering impossibly tall, its limbs unfolding like a spider's, long and jagged. With a speed that defied its grotesque form, it turned toward me, and before I could process what was happening, it charged. I ran. I spun on my heel, my heart slamming against my chest as I bolted back toward the passageway. My legs felt like lead, and every step seemed slower than the last. The room distorted around me, the walls warping, the air growing thick and cold. I stumbled forward, hearing the heavy, wet slaps of the creature's feet behind me, gaining faster than I could ever hope to run. Thud, 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 thud. Its footsteps pounded behind me, shaking the very ground beneath my feet. I slammed into the wall, my shoulder burning with pain as I ricocheted off, nearly losing my balance. My flashlight flickered wildly, the beam bouncing off the walls, distorting everything, making the shadows seem alive. I couldn't see the exit. I couldn't remember which way I had come from. The walls seemed to twist and shift, trapping me in a maze of stone and darkness. A scream clawed its way up my throat as I ran blindly, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, the creature's breath, a deep, wheezing rasp that grew closer with every second. I glanced over my shoulder just in time to see it lunging toward me, its long, bony fingers outstretched. I slammed into something hard, the wall. My vision swam as I crumpled to the floor, my body numb from the impact. My phone slipped from my hand and skittered across the ground, plunging the corridor into near darkness. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was silence. The kind of silence that suffocates, that presses down on you until you can't even think. I stayed on the floor, my cheek pressed against the cold stone, too terrified to move, too terrified to breathe. And then I felt it. Hot, rancid breath on the back of my neck. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I wanted to run, but my limbs wouldn't obey. The monster was right there, crouched over me, its claws hovering just above my skin. I could feel the weight of its gaze, the way its hollow eyes burned into me, the hunger radiating from its very being. A sharp pain ripped through my side as it grabbed me, claws sinking into my flesh. I tried to fight back, but it was useless. Its grip was like iron, cold and unyielding. The room spun as I was lifted from the ground, my vision blurring, the pain making everything seem distant, unreal. And then everything went black. The last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was the sound of its voice, low and guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand, but they were meant for me.